effort. A publisher approached me, McFarland, who does a lot of work on the 19th century, and asked me if I would do a companion to Trollope. And like many, I have read lots of Trollope. I had by no means read all of Trollope. And in fact, as one does with one's favorite authors, I was saving some. I was saving some for later. There were some Trollope books that I was saving for later. There were others that I just didn't feel compelled to read. The McDermotts of Ballycloran, for instance, being one of them. And I thought, well, this would be a very nice opportunity for me to have a full knowledge of Trollope. But I also realized, even though they gave me a 3-year deadline, they approached me, I think, in May of 2018 and said, you do not have to actually turn in the manuscript until 2021. I was still aware with the other things that I have to do, I could not do it by myself. So I thought, I need to get a collaborator. And I had met John Wirenius about 4 years before I was offered the contract. And John had written and published this novel called Phineas at Bay, which was the 3rd novel in the Phineas diptych, taking Phineas's career up until the 1890s and giving him the opportunity to have a whole new gallery of characters. For instance, there is a character very clearly based on a young Winston Churchill in John's novel. John is an attorney. He is also a deacon in the Episcopal Church, and he has a lot of expertise in some of the nooks and crannies of Victorian professional life that Trollope gets into. So I thought he would be the perfect collaborator, and we started to write this book together. He and I came to Trollope through different paths. If he joins, I will let him give his version of how he came. I very much came to Trollope through the Palliser books and through the 1970s dramatization by Simon Raven, which was shown in the US from 74 to 77. In the UK, it might have been earlier. And I was not really old enough to understand it when it began, but by the time it got to the Duke's children, I very much was, and I was very aware of Lord Silverbridge and Isabel Boncassen and Lady Mary and Frank Tregear and Lady Mabel Grex and all those wonderful characters. And I asked my mother to get me the books that the series was based on, and she got me the books. And I read through them. Obviously, as being 12, 13, I could not understand everything. Fortunately, the entire series was re-shown in late 1978. By then, I was very much old enough. And the trial of Phineas and the Phineas Redux scenes and the final breakup of Phineas and Lady Laura Kennedy, I remember just being harrowing, and it made a great impression on me. And I think John and I both agree that Phineas Redux is a very major book in the Trollope oeuvre. And so I was always aware of Trollope. I went on to get a BA, MA, and PhD in English. I did not ever, and John has a very different story here, I did not ever encounter Trollope in any classroom. Trollope for me was pleasure reading. He was for me what the professor didn't know about. In the 1990s, once I finished graduate school and I had time to read things not on the syllabus, when you become the maker of the syllabus and not the person who has to read the stuff from the syllabus, you have a lot more time. And at that, fortuitously, using that word correctly, meaning by chance, not fortunately, fortuitously at that point, the Oxford World's Classics was republishing a lot of Trollope in paperback. And I came upon books like Lady Anna or The Fixed Period or The Claverings or Cousin Henry that I had not known before. And that's really when I got the 2/3 of the oeuvre knowledge of Trollope I had coming into the book. In the aughts of this century, culminating in the Trollope bicentenary of 2015, academic interest in Trollope really accelerated. And Steve Amarnik, who's on this call, with colleagues, did a new edition of The Duke's Children that the Folio Society published in 2015. And that occasioned a lot of excitement. My good friend Warren Goodlad, who's a very prestigious academic, also has done a lot of work on Trollope. The Cambridge Companion that Carolyn Dever and Lisa Niles edited that came out about 12 years ago, to which I contributed. You had this academic work. So finally, my academic self and my Trollope self are dovetailing. And I very much wanted this book to be where the enthusiast and where the academic met, and which had the enthusiast zeal and sense of fun and enjoyment of all that our author has to offer, but also took stock of all the academic work. I mean, there's been academic work going back, to Michael Sadler in the 1920s and so on, and certainly Ruth App Roberts in the 1960s and so on, but particularly the recent wave of academic work where literature academia has for the first time taken up Trollope systematically, and I think taking up Trollope in a way that is at once very rigorous and also is empathetic about the author. So I really think Trollope criticism has achieved a sweet spot, and in what I did for the book, I very much wanted to write into that sweet spot. I see that John is here, so why don't I let John tell his story of how he came, which runs through Barchester and not so much Westminster, and then we could talk more about our approaches to the book itself. So I'll hand over to John.
I'm so glad to be with you all. Nicholas, thank you so much for giving, first of all, one of the few advantages of having one's computer roll over, make a croaking noise and die is I actually got to hear that lovely, kind introduction Nicholas gave of me when he thought I might still be able to speak in a timely manner. And thank you so much. I can only say Nicholas is the most generous and wonderful co-writer to work with you could conceivably imagine. It has been such a delight tossing entries back and forth and in a collaborative way, sharpening each other's work. It's just been a pure delight. You wouldn't think that writing a companion to Trollope would be fun, but it really has been. It's been a delight to work with Nicholas on this. I missed the chance, so I'm going to give you my own quick introduction to Trollope. It came in 2 stages. I was a Masterpiece Theater junkie in the 80s, and Alan Plater's Barchester adaptation, which only covered the Warden and Barchester Towers, but nonetheless, it still grabbed me, partially because of the brilliant performances of Donald Pleasance and Susan Hampshire and of Alan Rickman, but just the whole notion of this good, gentle, kindly man without realizing it was steeped in a basically corrupt society and basically a corrupt sinecure that was never meant to be as easy and slothful a life as it could be. And so Mr. Harding's great virtues are not really fully actuated in his life until he becomes aware of how easy he has it and how he is receiving the vast majority of the sums donated to the wool carters. That grabbed me. And I ordered the books, the whole Barchester series. At that time, they were not available in the United States. I ordered them from a coupon I found that allowed me to order from Oxford Press. And Oxford Unity Press's World's Classic 6-volume paperback series was how I first read Trollope. And it was even better than all the work those marvelous actors and actresses brought to it, because the depth of characterization was like nothing I'd ever before seen in all my reading. I was an omnivorous reader, but Trollope grabbed me the minute I opened The Warden. And so when I went to college, I read these books, the Barchester novels, through the summer between high school and college. And when I went to college at Fordham in the Bronx of New York, which is basically this beautiful little mirage-like oasis in the middle of, shall we say, not a particularly gentle-looking place to be. But there we were in buildings from the 1840s and 50s. And my first English professor there was Walter Kendrick, who had published a book on Trollope, The Novel Machine. And so I got to talk Trollope with Walter Kendrick, who was amazingly witty. He would stand up at the beginning of a class, and we'd spend most of the class laughing as he took us through each novel or each part of a novel we were covering. And at the end of the hour, we would look at our notes, and you would have a wonderful, cogent analysis of the books we were talking about or the portions thereof. So to work with Walter Kendrick was just a marvelous opportunity, and I learned so much from him. His love for Trollope was really sincere. His book is not all, he wrote several articles in addition to his book on Trollope, but he also had a great affection for Gothic fiction. And he swore up and down that he was the only person who had persevered to the end of Varney the Vampire or The Feast of Blood by Thomas Prescott Prest or Malcolm Ryder, depending on who you believe. Kendrick was a Prest guy, for what it's worth. His affection for Trollope went to the characterization. And if you see his analyses in The Novel Machine or in his standalone articles, you'll see he dives deep into the characterization. He was particularly insightful on Lizzie Eustace, who he both despised and loved. And that was kind of my own response to Lizzie. So that is how I became addicted to Trollope. I read The Pallisers, and eventually I ended up seeing the series. My viewing the series with my wife in 2013 is actually what got me to write Phineas at Bay, because after reading the books, I was not happy where Phineas was left. I thought that, in particular, the dialogue between Phineas Finn and Plantagenet Palliser, when they're discussing equality, and Plantagenet is taking the more progressive position and Phineas is taking the more conservative position, that seemed to me not at one with the Phineas of his two novels where he is the lead character. The radical Irishman seemed to have become, I think John Sutherland in his introduction refers to him as almost a drone. And we see flashes of Phineas's fire in defending the Duchess, but we don't really see the political Phineas at all in the Prime Minister or even in the Duke's Children. He's basically just in office. And so how did he get there? I could not persuade myself that that is where Trollope meant to leave Phineas Finn. It did not ring incredibly true with me that that would be where his endpoint would be. And so I wrote my novel, which I sent the draft to Nicholas after hearing him give a tremendously great presentation to the Trollope Society USA on the Phineas diptych. And I asked him if he would be kind enough to read it. He very generously said he would. The very next day I was in jury duty, and I'm waiting to see if I'm picked on a jury, and I suddenly get a series of emails from Nicholas giving me the most wonderful positive feedback and constructive criticism on how to make the book better. So when Nicholas reached out to me and said, would you be interested in helping me and working with me on a companion to Trollope's novels and all of his work, I said, of course. How could I not? And here we are today talking about Trollope. So for someone who started out in the Barchester world, I ended up becoming very rooted in the Pallisers, partially because of my work on Phineas at Bay. Nicholas and I worked on every entry together. There's not a one of mine that he didn't edit, and I believe I went through every one of his. And you can sort of feel, it feels to me like a very joint production. It feels to me that everything bears both of our impresses. And for me, Nicholas's insight that Trollope never phoned it in rings absolutely true. I think his first few novels, where he's creating himself as a writer, as a novelist, as opposed to an official writer of reports, are not quite in the mid-season form that we see him in for the rest of his career, but they're interesting in that we're seeing those primary concerns that will carry him throughout. He's always concerned with the marginalized, with the underdog, with the person who is not at the heart of society. Even when he's writing about lords and ladies, he finds himself attracted to the oddball, to the person who doesn't fit. And for example, Laura Kennedy in Phineas Finn is that at her very start. She's a very masculine woman in the description that Trollope gives of her at the beginning, and yet he stresses her beauty is not diminished by her aquiline nose, by her red hair, by her very strong mannish postures in terms of the way she walks or sits or leans in at someone, which do not comport with ladylike demeanor in the 19th century. And yet, before she wrecks herself, she's tremendously vital and attractive. She works. Violet Effingham is Phineas's effort to go for the conventional Trollope girl. But he can't do that because she's in love with Lord Chiltern, who brings out this very unconventional side of her. And so we see and I'm using Phineas Finn as just an example because we can see this throughout all of his works. Trollope finds nonconformists and those who don't fit the societal expectations of his time to be quite fascinating. And they're the ones he really digs into and pulls out from them elements of feeling that you might not expect in the 19th century. There's an American website called TV Tropes, which applies literary analysis to all kinds of pop culture. And one of the tropes they have on it, I think, is very classic Trollope. It says, and forgive the mild disagreeable term, getting crap under the radar. Trollope is the master of this. He gets away with murder because he's good old, bluff, hearty, kindly, one of us, Anthony Trollope, clubman, hunter, what? I mean, he could almost be a Nigel Bruce caricature at some points. And yet, there are two honest men in the way we live now. Squire Carberry, of course, right? Sure, Squire Carberry. The other one is Ezekiel Bregart, the Jewish banker. They are the only two honest men in the book. And Bregart is the only one of them who combines honesty with generosity of spirit. Carberry's honest, but he's harsh. He's upset. He does the right thing against his own nature. Bregart is the only gentleman in the way we live now. Madame Max has been called Trollope's greatest gentleman. Not by me. I love it, though. It fits. Madame Max is either Jewish or not Jewish, depending on which version of her introduction you read. In Phineas Finn, she is patently Jewish. The illustrations have her in stereotypical Eastern curls, and her dress is redolent of the East. In Phineas Redux, she's more conventionally described. And you can see that as the marriage between Phineas and Madame Max is looming, he sort of brings her along to make her fit a little bit more, but not that much. Because Madame Max does not repine as her man is suffering. She does not go to offer to create scandal as Lady Laura does. Lady Laura can't help him. She doesn't have a way to be of use to Phineas other than to want to stand by his side, which would actually make him look more guilty because of the scandal involving her late husband, Robert Kennedy. Madame Max, by contrast, goes to Vienna, hunts down the evidence that will free Phineas, and does it with absolute casualness. It's the right thing to do. She does it. She goes. She hits the road. She is the knight errant in Phineas Redux. And it's a marvelous, marvelous fact that Phineas is not in any way intimidated by her. Here's this woman who's richer than he is, saves his life, saves his honor, gets him sprung from prison. He's not at all in any way feeling that she's too much, she's too powerful, she's too strong. He is absolutely perfectly content to marry this woman who loves him and whom he loves. And again, with the TV trope, getting things past the radar, the Jewish foreigner from Vienna marries the Irish Catholic. Remember, Phineas, unlike his siblings, does not become a Protestant. That's the happy ending, and the readers lap it up. People who they would not consider to be one of us in real life, Trollope casts his spell and makes us love them. And more difficult, he makes the people of his own time love them, despite their own biases. That, to me, is the hallmark of Anthony Trollope. And I pound that gong a lot because I think that Trollope does not get the due credit for being as cleverly subversive and as warm-hearted as he is. I think part of this is because his feeling is better developed than his theory. If you read Trollope on the place of women in his didactic writings, in his narrator's little asides, or in his autobiography, he'll toe the line, the conventional line. Women's rights, their best right is a right to a husband, huzzah. But in his writing, he's so much better than this. In his novels, when he enters into the imagination and to the world of his imagination, the depth of warmth and understanding and comprehension unfold like a flower. And so he writes far better than he thinks. And I just think that is a fillip to his character that gives him that insight. The young boy who was himself beaten up and mistreated at Harrow, who can sympathize with the outsider. And that, I think, gives him a vitality that very few Victorian authors have.
It's so interesting when you were saying the name Ezekiel Brecker, the transcription, which generally has been very good, said a deal breaker. And in a way, the transcription knew more than it seemed, because, you know, that character would have been a deal breaker in many other fictions, would have been somebody who was excluded from happiness and virtue. And yet it's very important. We have a whole entry on Jews in Trollope, and our guest in the audience, Steve Amernick, has also written very insightfully on that topic. And there are some anti-Semitic moments in Trollope, but there also are some very philo-Semitic moments. And of course, there is also in the Bertrams and A Ride Across Palestine, even some proto-Zionism in Trollope. And so, yeah, there is, and I totally agree with John, Trollope was not, as opposed to somebody like Harriet Martineau, he was not a theorist of radical progress, but his engagement, I think the post office had a lot to do with this, that he worked in a job where he traveled a lot and met a lot of people and learned to see humanity steadily and see it whole. And he really got to know people, and that came through in his fiction, where he treats everybody as individuals. And even though, yeah, there's Dr. Olivia Q. Fleabody, who's the parody of feminism, but then there's some very strong women who he admires, like from the same period, like Ella Dormer. And you cannot put Trollope into a box, into his views of the other. That's something that is very much in play in his fiction. And when you least expect it, yeah, it's that couple of Madame Max Goesler and Phineas Finn, who, as John points out, retains his Catholicism and, of course, campaigns on church disestablishment, which is pretty big. Yeah, it's quite compelling. And in a way, we have been taught to see Trollope as more timorous on social issues than he was. He was not a Marxist. He was not a radical. He definitely has his conservative moments. But his self-definition of advanced conservative liberal, the advanced and liberal in that phrase do have to be taken seriously.
It's fascinating too, because one of the things that I think happens is when Trollope, the more deeply he engages with a character, the more he looks through that character's eyes and feels that character's feelings. And that's when the miracle really happens with Trollope. I noticed that most of the really anti-Semitic caricatures in Trollope normally are very minor figures. They flicker in and out. And even someone who is as awful as the Reverend Joseph Emilius becomes more interesting to Trollope as he goes on. And in Phineas Redux, one of the things that's interesting about him is he's absolutely cool under the pressure of being a murder suspect. Now, here's something I learned from Nicholas in the lecture he gave to the Trollope Society USA. The notion of Emilius as a dark mirror image to Phineas was so persuasive to me, the way Nicholas set it out, that I actually had a meeting between Phineas and Emilius in my novel Phineas at Bay, where they meet at midnight in Phineas's chambers so that they could explore each other's characters just a little bit. And that became important to me because the fact that they're both charming to women, that they're both intelligent, self-directed, with their own goals, one much considerably worse than the other, obviously, and one much less selfish than the other. But the fact that they have a certain skill set and a certain outsider status in common is, I think, very interesting. And it gives Emilius a level of status that most of the villains in Trollope don't get, even though he is not explored internally to any great degree.
And that's a very important point, because usually people think if somebody has complex villains, it is villains who we see inside of, who have a sympathetic streak to them, as Dostoevsky does sometimes. But yeah, he doesn't, because he presents the outward aspects of Emilius in that juxtaposition to Phineas. He doesn't have to. And of course, Phineas is a presentable Irish Catholic, and Emilius is this continental Jewish person who becomes a priest, and who obviously, before he is disgraced, is chic, gets aristocrats who don't normally go into church to attend Sunday services. And so they are both kind of breaking the mold. They are kind of outside the box figures. And if Phineas's outside the boxness bends towards the positive, even though he is suspected of the murder of Bonteen, and of course Emilius's goes towards the negative. But one of the things he does with those multi-plot books is the parallels are always there between the different strands, even though they aren't explicit, obviously. And Can You Forgive Her as well? When you have the two scoundrels, George Vavasor and Burgo Fitzgerald, who are different degrees of scoundrel. And in a way, the difference between that degree of scoundrelness is, in terms of ethics and morality, all the difference. He's very good at constructing that. John, do you want to talk about your biggest surprise in doing all this? I think I talked about mine.
So my biggest surprise in doing this work was how much I found The Duke's Children to be a haunted book, by which I mean Plantagenet Palliser is haunted by the ghost of Glencora, by the ghost of their early days and her love for Burgo, which he feels reflected in his daughter's love. And again, the book is also haunted by that story. It's haunted by the fact that there's another version of the book, a revenant almost, the complete book that has been at last released to the public, thanks to Stephen Almernick and company. And in that book, we see a different story. Which is the real The Duke's Children? Is it the one that's been taught in university for well over a century? Is it the one we all read when we first came to Trollope? Or is it the new one, the complete one, the one Trollope actually wrote, the one he wanted published? The hauntings in The Duke's Children, we see echoes of all of the storylines in the Palliser series throughout that last novel. And it's a wonderful little symphony of a novel, because in either version, but it's richer, so much richer in the restored version. I'll give one example, the relationship between Phineas Plantagenet and Madame Max becomes much deeper when we get Phineas's reactions in the restored text. So to me, that a novel that could be read as just the final volume of the political series or the Palliser series, whichever you want to call them, the parliamentary series, is actually shot through with grief and haunting throughout throughout 3/4 of the book. And only at the end, when Palliser comes to his recognition that he has to resign running his children's lives, he has to let them free, does the haunting end. And it's so beautifully subtle. You could miss it. In fact, the first 2 times I read it, I did miss it. Then I read the complete version and got thinking, and then I read the originally published version. And I don't think I'm making up that haunting. I think it's real.
That's beautiful. And it brings the Palliser series, the stronger Duke's Children, the Duke's Children that is the climax and not an anticlimax, not a postlude. And I think a lot of people, since Glencora is dead throughout, there's a bit of anticlimax about the Duke's Children in the expurgated version. But since it's been restored to us, and so it matches the Last Chronicle of Barset, which is such a major book and so significant a book. And I mean, the third plot of that book, the Mr. Dalrymple and Miss Van Siever, wow. I mean, that is a craftsman who does that third plot. You have Mr. Crawley, you have, of course, Lily and Lily Dale and Johnny Ames and the cementing of their failed courtship. But then you have that third plot, which is so interesting in terms of the status of the artist, the status of women, the status of representation. And we now have a Duke's Children, which is just as it is a bookend in one sense in Can You Forgive Her, as John said, bringing it full circle, we also have a Duke's Children, which is laterally in relationship to the stunning final installment in the Barsetshire Chronicles. So yeah, kudos to Steve and his colleagues for bringing us that. We have some comments in the chat, and then I think we should probably open it up to questions, but I wanted to get with comments in the chat. Yeah, why did he call Spanish Main in the West Indies and the Spanish Main his best book? I mean, you'd have to ask him. I think it's, you know, if he is, among other things, a realist, and Anthony Trollope saw himself as a realist, C.P. Snow, who did the book on Trollope, also wrote a book called The Realists. And of course, realism can be many different things. But if you are a realist, I think something you take pride in is writing about a subject which few other people write about and getting it in your view right. And I think in writing about the Caribbean, not a subject much talked about, not a subject people visited a lot. And, of course, after the fading, after abolition was achieved, after emancipation was achieved in the British Empire in 1833, people stopped talking about it. People talked about slavery in the US. And you had Harriet Martineau, who already mentioned, going over here and talking about slavery. But the Caribbean itself, nobody talked about. And nobody certainly talked about Panama. This was before the canal. And it's so interesting, he was at Suez. He was also at Panama. He was at the site of both of the world-spanning canals. And I think he felt he had seen this subject and written about it, and no one else had. And again, that triumph he has. This is a man who writes about Australia, South America, North America, Ireland, England. It's the same person. It's the same viewpoint. There's somebody with the same values. He doesn't lose himself. So I don't think, I find, of course, the racial language is questionable in that book, and it has been attacked recently for that. And I understand those attacks, and it's certainly not even my favorite of the travel books. I, in fact, like the South Africa book, not much esteemed, but I like that one better. But I think that is probably why he said it. And then the comment, which John might want to weigh in on as well, about the Scatchards in Dr. Thorne, and the way character will always out, no matter what the external appurtenance is. Yeah, I think he's very good at that. Also true with Mr. Emilius. They're just, you can try to kind of live in, or Mr. Lopez, you can try to live into the myth of yourself, but who you are is going to come out. That I think is his moral and ethical belief. And of course, those instances is tragic. It's unbelievably tragic with Mr. Lopez.
Mm-hmm. Lopez's death is such a surprise, in the sense that this is someone who you think of as he's going to be holding on to take the main chance no matter what. And Trollope makes the suicide credible because we see the good aspects. The good is, let's not oversimplify. We see the more benevolent, the more acceptable face of Lopez is not completely a mask. He does have feelings. He does want to fit in. He wants to be a part of this family. He just doesn't know the language, and he doesn't know the way to negotiate the family. And so his avarice, which could have been very well taken care of within the family structure, becomes all-consuming in a way, and it's not as dramatic an example, but it's not unlike He Knew He Was Right, where Trevelyan just keeps adding fuel to his own fire and burns himself out. So too, I think Lopez, if Lopez had understood the nature of the people he was living among and to whose care he was effectively entrusting his prosperity and trying to get money from them for his speculative business, if he had known the rules of the game and known the protocol and had known how to wait, known how to create trust, but he had been living this hand over fist existence where it's about the quick hit, get it now, move it along, get the money and move on and make money, make more money. And so because everything for Lopez was so World of Melmotte, he had no idea how to embed himself into a different environment. And so for all of his efforts and all of his genuine feelings, he fails. And I think that's why he kills himself at the end of the day, is not simply because Lizzie Eustace turns him down, but rather because he realizes he's burnt himself out. He's lost his opportunity.
Yeah, and he's like the Energizer Bunny of scoundreldom. You do figure he will always come back. But yeah, in a way, if only he had read the first 4 volumes of the Palliser series, he would have had the education into the world of the landed gentry that he would have needed to get along, to be a good son-in-law to Mr. Warden and so on. But it's as with so many novelists discover this, the people who live their lives on the basis of going for the main chance never even get the main chance. They not only fail morally in any larger abstract sense, they don't even get the main chance they're looking for. And yeah, it is. But we do empathize with him. And of course, Tolstoy, that scene, that suicide in Tenway Junction, Tolstoy very much influenced Anna Karenina's suicide in the novel of that name. So it has Lopez did become a figure in world literature, although I don't think that would be of much consolation to him. American Senator, yeah, a character of Arabella Trefoil. That is a very interesting book. First of all, because of the carryover with Ayala's Angel, the Rufford references in both. It's almost as if he was thinking late in life of doing a third series. The hunting scenes in that book were among my favorites, and I have never hunted other than try to get my cats in from outdoors. I really have never been a hunter, but the scenes in that book, I thought he did very vividly. And the way that Senator Gotobed is used as a outside lens. Trollope is using that senator as an outside lens on an English life that he knows. And it's almost like in his unpublished, posthumously published book, The New Zealander, where he looks at England as a New Zealander in 2100 would look at it. It's a very interesting perspective. And I think it enables Trollope to regenerate that material and to not get bored with his own material. So that's a perfect example of a book. Yeah, this is probably, of course, as an American, I'm going to be interested in that character of the American senator. When I first saw the title, I assumed that was Mr. Boncassen. That was just another book about Mr. Boncassen. When I saw that title as a kid, I was surprised to find it was a different character, although Mr. Boncassen is mentioned, so they are not the same person. But I didn't expect to find it of much interest. But yeah, I do think it is an interesting late jewel and an example of the fact that you cannot pigeonhole minor Trollope, that he always finds. There's that Arabella, there's always a character you find interesting, that that you gravitate to or you find provocative. Yeah, so I enjoyed that book, and that was one of the ones I was saving. Now, again, the pathos of that is I now have no more Trollope saved. I really have read all of him, and I was planning to save some of those books for my 60s and 70s or so on. But too bad, I can't do that anymore. But I did enjoy that book.